recording? Okay. Very good. Yes, yeah, that's fine if y'all laugh, it's okay. I don't even know how long that'll record for. Okay, so anyway, we're talking about limited government, so democracy. So democracy will limit government, okay? One of the other things, self-government, okay? And that goes back to the people. So you can start connecting these ideas in terms of self-government, and then of course you relate that back to the people. So having that power, of course, will limit your government. But then also, if you were to be asked a free response question about self-government and the importance of self-government as a concept, what's an example you could use? Amendment number 9. What does Amendment 9 say? Do you remember if you take that 9 and you flip it around, it's a P? That means that people have more rights than those that are listed in the Constitution. Okay? So people have more rights than those that are listed in the Constitution. So that helps with self-government. Also, something else that is kind of there but not directly linked, but it could be, okay, social contract theory, right? Because where does the power of government come from? The consent of the governed. So you could also use as well, I'm going to throw this up here too, you could use Amendment 9 as an example. You can use the social contract theory. And then you can use popular sovereignty, which is actually up here too as one of the 6 principles that we study on the Constitution. I was just scared to make too many lines because it would kind of look like those spaghetti models, you know, the cone of uncertainty, you know, where could this tropical system go, who knows. So, but it really is all interconnected. So you've got the social contract theory, which of course is also connected to natural rights. So what are our 3 natural rights that are listed in the Declaration of Independence? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Good. So you've got life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Okay, it's just 3. So those natural rights, you have those rights because you are people. Okay, congratulations. So because you're people, you have those rights. And then you start thinking about things like the purpose of government. So what is the purpose of government? Main purpose of government is to do what? You better believe it. That's your main purpose. Now they do other things. So I asked this, we're kind of studying the same thing in civics, and I asked my civics students about that, and they said, well, it's to do things like provide services and order, to support the people, and absolutely, they do that as well. The main thing that they're supposed to do is to protect your rights. Some people will say, of course, well, what about property ownership? Well, it's your right to own property. What about free speech, or your right to free speech? So they're looking at protecting your rights, not just your natural rights, but also your civil rights, okay? And then, of course, we have, just kind of going down here with these blue sticky notes, multiple access points for stakeholders. Just saying thank you, AP, for that lovely explanation of multiple access points. What does that mean? What does that mean? Multiple means more than one. Okay? I'm going to blame it on the rain today. I sound like Milli Vanilli. Blame it on the rain? No? Y'all are too young for that, aren't you? Milli Vanilli? Okay, we'll listen to it later. So multiple access points. So there's many ways for, what does it mean to access something? You know, when you try to log in, it says access denied. Yeah. So you're trying to get into something. What are we trying to get into? It's what? Government. That's kind of what we're studying. So multiple access points to government. Okay, whatever that means, whatever government is. And basically government, don't forget, the base definition of government is the the ruling authority. So really you're trying to get into the ruling authority of your country. And who is the ruling authority of your country? Government? Yes, okay, government, but like,
President.
huh?
The president.
Okay, the president, Congress, okay, state government, local government, but they're all still made up by who? There you go. So we are our own government, which is kind of weird to kind of think about that. It's basically a cycle, you know, a circle of, you know, or a spiral down into the pits of Hades, I don't know. Anyway, so I've got that on video, I'll have to edit that out. So, I mean, you've got multiple access points for stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? Well, of course, you've got citizens, any kind of residents, even though if they're not citizens, okay? You've got politicians, businesses, you can do consumers, right? You could do a variety of organizations. We could go on forever, okay? Anyone who has a stake in our government being successful, banks, industry, school systems. So all of these access points, you have to have access to your government, okay? That's what they're trying to create, all right? Now that's where I took this line here, multiple access points for stakeholders, and connected it to issues, okay? Now the problem is, and we don't have time to go over it like all today, so I listed those, but if you'll notice, if you back up some, I've got Republicans on the right and, well, Republicans on the right and Democrats on the left. So you need to think about, of course, how each of these groups are going to feel about the issues. So in saying that, the main thing to consider, I'll have that mark in a minute. I'll use red. So remember, on the right-hand side for these issues, on the right-hand side for Republicans, these guys are going to support less federal government, and on the left-hand side, these guys are going to support more federal government involvement, right? Yes, Ms. Frank? Good job. Y'all already know this? Am I going over too basic of issues? Or does this help? Is it too basic? Too basic. Y'all got it. Okay. So then when you look at this, being a little more specific about some of our terms that are on our list, you can start backing up and start talking about the different types of economic and social policies, okay? But before I do that, okay, I want to talk about the creation of the Constitution and how it blends with balance of power and what's happening there, okay? So the next section, and I'm just going to put this over here on the board, because the second part is the creation of the U.S. Constitution. Why did we create the U.S. Constitution?
To limit the government.
To limit the government's power, okay? Back there. We create it, but we create it specifically to give it enough power to do what it needs to do, but not more than it needs to do, okay? So it still needs to represent the people, okay? So there's one question I used to always ask students on civics tests. I wish Treasure was in here. Y'all remember Treasure Flake? She would always complain about my civics tests. I'm saying that on camera. Hopefully she sees that too. But the deal is that the question was always, who is the most powerful group? Something like that. Who's the most powerful group in our country? And I had like president, Congress, judicial branch, and citizens. And a lot of people would answer either Congress or the president, but it's actually the people, okay? Because this is what it's all about, is protecting the rights of the people. We create this structure in order to protect us and our rights. It's not like a monarchy, it's not like a dictatorship, it's not somebody else telling us what to do, it's us telling each other what to do. Basically, which goes back to looking at the influence of the social contract theory, okay, in our government. So with the creation of the Constitution, first of all, you have that foundation of founding documents. So the founding documents, those documents leading up to the Constitution, you know, the Declaration of Independence, which of course is not a constitution, but it does outline some of our basic beliefs about government. State constitutions, which is eventually what we're going to model the U.S. Constitution after, and then the Articles of Confederation, which is a huge failure. And why is that such a huge failure? Because we're afraid, okay? We're trying to create a what? Limited government, and we do that, but we don't give it enough power, okay? So I think, you know, even though that wasn't a smart idea for us today, looking back at it, I'm glad it happened in a certain way, because now we can take a look at how much is not enough government power. We can see a lot of instances of too many examples of government power, but looking at not enough. What does it look like when it's not enough? And then we see, of course, Shays Rebellion linked to that. So that's one of your terms that you should have to know. So then with the creation of the U.S. Constitution, Second Continental Congress, Philadelphia Convention with the Grand Committee, creating the Great Compromise, okay? So the creation of the Constitution, you're looking at the second, this is all kind of linked together, the Second Continental Congress, all right, which is, of course, you're looking at the Philly Convention, which is the meeting to change the Articles of Confederation, but then they realized how bad it was, so they just totally scrapped it and started all over again. And then the meeting of the Grand Committee. The Grand Committee is going to be the committee that establishes the Great Compromise. What does the Great Compromise do?
Isn't it like form the two different parts of Congress?
Yes. So you've got the Great Compromise, which is going to be the legislative branch or Congress. Why was that so important to create that first?
Because they make the laws.
Exactly. You got to make them before you can enforce them or interpret them. So they're going to make the laws, and it's also designed to be representative of the people. Okay? But here's the problem with how we create this federal government, by the way. So the problem is that we have a federal government. I hope the purple works. We have the federal government, but the federal government is made up of states and the people. So when you're creating the Great Compromise, which part of Congress represents the states? Senate, and then the House, of course, represents the people. Okay, you can't forget about that. So what we're doing is we're adding layers that's going to lead us into, in just a second, checks and balances, all to create this idea of limited government. So you have a bicameral legislature for that. Then you also have other compromises that, even though, you know, like the 3/5 compromise and the compromise on importation of slaves is not really going to apply anymore, we still use the Electoral College. It basically is leading us to consensus building. You have to know the word consensus. That's a main word that's used for the legislative branch. You have to work together, this consensus building. And then you have the structure of the U.S. Constitution that we'll talk about in just a second, and principles. These principles are going to all also balance powers to create limited government, okay? So they're all connected both ways. So these principles, of course, the amending process. I'm running out of room. So on the amending process, who can propose an amendment? Do you remember? I'll write this down. There's that. Does anybody need to take a picture? I'm going to erase it and start all over. Anybody want to take a picture of this hot mess? If you want to come back here and get a closer picture, you can. I'll get out of the way. So. Mr. Allen's going to come in and say, nobody's going to be able to understand that, Miss Gray. Okay, so looking at the principles. So when you look at again, we're still on the creation of the Constitution, but we're also going to blend limited government with that too. So you've got the principles of the U.S. Constitution, which is there to balance power. So one of the first one is the amending process. You have to be able to change. If you can't change your constitution, then you're in a world of hurt. Because then, your constitution is only gonna last as long as what the society does at the time. So in the amending process, remember, it's 2/3 proposed. And who can propose that? Congress and states can both propose an amendment, okay? Federal government and state governments, all right? But it requires a supermajority, again, 3/4 to ratify meaning to accept, of either state conventions or state legislatures, okay? So the only people that can pass an amendment would be the states. And of course, if I could have a whiteboard that would go all the way down to the bottom of the floor, I would draw all that back up to limited government. You're limiting the power of the federal government by telling the federal government, you can suggest changes, but it's us, the states and the people, who have to agree to follow them. Does that make sense for limited government? So if you're asked a question about the concept of limited government, that's a perfect example. Actually, any of these principles would be a perfect example of how to limit the federal government's power. The idea of self-government, the idea of multiple access points, the idea of having a democratic republic, all of those would be good ideas for limited government. So then the next one is going to be rule of law. That's one of the principles. And that is just going to say, of course, will y'all tell me, do you remember what rule of law means? That is muy importante. Super important.
It applies to everyone.
Yeah, the law applies equally to all laws. Laws are going to apply equally to everyone. So everyone has to follow the same laws. So there can't be exceptions for some people because of the positions that they are in, for example. And so that, of course, what amendments can you connect that to, by the way? Five. We call these our due process amendments, okay? So they're very closely related when you're looking at rule of law and due process. So we have these due process amendments because of the concept of rule of law. So even though a lot of people kind of glaze over that, because really we focus on federalism pretty much here, with, also we focus, of course, checks and balances, and then popular sovereignty, but rule of law is pretty important as well, okay? So then we get into the separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers, RS, and checks and balances. So, of course, you're trying to, again, limit the power of the federal government by establishing this not only between branches, but also intra-branch checks, okay? So you have a variety of different kinds of checks. Let me put that in red. So you have inter-branch checks, which is going to be legislative, executive, and judicial, right? Everybody knows those. Who can veto laws? President. Who can override those vetoes? Congress, okay? Now, as we're talking about that with the amendment process and all of this, you can also stop for just a second and ask about the idea of supermajority. Supermajority, of course, means over 51%. So usually the fractions that we use are 2/3 or 3/4. So why are you looking at a supermajority? Why is having a supermajority more important than just a 51% simple majority? Why is supermajority important?
So that one party can just strong.
So it's either, I won't say nonpartisan, but at least it will be bipartisan support. Bi means two, so you've got bipartisan support that is not just politically based, because of course that could further divide our country. So on some issues, you would need the supermajority instead of just the simple majority. You also have intra-branch checks, okay? So what are some examples of an intra-branch check? The Senate has some powers and the House has some powers, okay? So also, an intra-branch check, just looking at the executive branch, some of the agencies are independent, so some of your independent agencies in the, executive branch, they do not answer directly to the president. So those are just some ideas. You also have a separation of powers, checks and balances, levels of government. So you have federal, you have state, and you have local, okay? So each of those branches, of course, should be able to check and balance one another, all right? Then you also have power of the people as well, which you have, again, multiple access points. That's checks and balances because you're watching the nation. So you have your multiple access points. You have the people being able to do things like referendums. And we'll talk more about that in the next unit, but referendums, initiatives, and propositions, which basically you can circumvent, citizens can circumvent the, I'll bring the rest of those guys in. Can circumvent the legislature, so you can get things on the ballot that people want. So for example, if the people want to have a law, one of the most popular is going to be like an alcohol referendum. So the legislature, they can suggest sometimes laws and then let the people vote on them. Hey people, oh wait. Hey people, can you hear me? Okay, well, I wouldn't say all that. Okay, so thank you, Marissa. So anywho, we are looking at, and I'm gonna unplug this. It's just a presentation part, and I'm taking you with me on a field trip. Okay. So, oops, click it off of me. That might not be far enough away. So we're talking about this hot mess on the board. Can you see that? I'm not sure exactly how well y'all can see. So we're talking about this, and I'm writing some notes and junk and stuff on the board. And I've also tried to record this. I yelled at my iPad. Savannah had to tell me how to work my iPad. The camera, like how to work the camera. Listen, it'll happen to you too one day. Like, there'll be some new technology and your kids will tell you, yeah, you people are probably gonna have kids one day. So we'll tell you how to work your iPad, and they're only like 3 or whatever thing that they're gonna have. So what we're talking about, the 3 main points, and this is just a review. So we've pulled up our Unit 1 and 2 review sheets, and we're talking about how all this plays out together. And then we're gonna make a study tool. We're gonna work on making a study tool. And that's our job for today. That, and you can also start with your progress check for the unit, and that comes from AP Classroom. Okay, so we were talking about, we've already talked a good bit about over here, it says limited government. I wish I had like, here we go. Limited government, I don't know how much or how well you can see any of that, but limited government is here, and we're talking about, we've already talked about democracy, self-government, social contract, natural rights, multiple access points, and down here some issues that divide our country. So now we're talking about the ones up here, and all of those up there actually are the principles of the U.S. Constitution. So we talked about the amendment process, rule of law, separation of powers, and checks and balances. So we're looking at different ways to check and balance government. And we've learned, class, that the major check on government is who? the people. It's the people that are gonna be the major check on government. So, we are looking at separation of powers and checks and balances, and there's more than just that little triangle that we've done in civics about how the legislative branch can check the executive branch. There's intra-branch checks, like the House versus the Senate, different levels of government, federal, state, and local, and multiple access points for stakeholders, which is a fun phrase. So here's my question at home. Marissa, can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay. It sounds like it's talking in a can. All right. So another one of our ideas that limits government and is a principle of the Constitution is federalism. And then, of course, notice I've got a whole bunch of these orange sticky notes around it. That's because there's a lot going on with federalism. And federalism is linked to these levels of government, okay? So with federalism, you do have things that the federal government can do, and you have things that the state government can do, state governments can do. This is where a lot of terminology comes in, okay? So with the federal government, you have powers that are enumerated. Enumerated powers means listed. Why do you list powers? What does listing do? Listing limits, okay? It gives it power and limits its power. Go ahead and say it, you know you want to. At the same time. I should make a TikTok about that. I'll work on it. So, I do have an idea. On and off at the same time, in and out. I'll work on that. How long can a TikTok be, like 30 seconds? 60, oh, double time. All right, I got a lot of time. All right, that makes me happy. Okay, although I think China will see that, but they can learn about this. That's good. So enumerated powers, they're also called delegated. To delegate means to give powers. So they're delegated to the federal government by the Constitution. They're also called express powers. Same thing. Now, granted, I'll be honest, there are minute differences in this terminology, but they're really pretty much all federal government powers. Okay? Express powers, they're expressed in the Constitution that belong to the federal government. Another phrase that's used, implied powers. Implied powers is not listed in the Constitution, but they still belong to the federal government. Okay? So it basically gives the government like an et cetera. Reserved powers belong to the states. And then, of course, in the middle you have concurrent, which both of them can do, like tax, okay? Now, on the front board up here, again, we were talking in civics, and so the thing about this was, just going back to the basics, and here's the, for y'all at home. Let's see, there we go. You're looking at like a balance between the 50 states, oh, that looks terrible when I'm shaking that, and the federal government. So you've got like declare war, I just shut it down, that's hilarious. Oops. Cancel. No, don't shut it down, cancel. Oh, I cut off my Teams, that's hilarious. I just literally held it by the button. Done. Alright, let's see if I can pull them back up. It's kind of embarrassing. Anyway, so that's your concurrent power, because you know, marriage laws are not in the U.S. Constitution. Cancel that, please. Oops. Sorry, I threw y'all out. If you're watching, sorry. Important message, bus delays. Okay, got it. So, anywho. Oops. I'm so glad I chose to put that on there. Yes. I want to join the conversation. Why is it not letting me join the conversation? Join. It's taking too long. There we go. Hey, so can y'all hear me again? Because I held y'all by the power button, so I powered off my computer. So, I just wish that had been during an observation. That would have been fun too. But anyway, at least it's been recorded, so that's good. All right. So we were talking about federalism, and what the image out we were looking at was looking at things the federal government can do, like declare war, versus things that states can do, like marriage licenses. So when we talk about some more Supreme Court cases, we'll talk about Obergefell versus Hodges. If you're not familiar with that Supreme Court case, that's the Supreme Court case that talks about gay marriage. As that was happening, the Supreme Court struck down the federal law Defense of Marriage Act, which is known as DOMA. And the reason that they did that was because, is there anything in the Constitution that says the federal government can regulate marriage? No. Can you make that an implied power? Well, it's debatable, but the Supreme Court said no, that should not even be an implied power. So, people who are for or against same-sex marriage basically were saying it's a win for both sides about what you believe, but the Supreme Court wasn't calling it either. The Supreme Court said it's not in the Constitution, like the federal government shouldn't be saying that, so you leave it up to the states to make that decision. So marriage laws, of course, are going to be left at the states. The problem comes with by not allowing people to get married, is that a violation of Amendment 14? Then the Supreme Court goes back and says, yes, and they ruled that in Obergefell versus Hodges, that yes, you're not allowing access to marriage for people who are gay. But then you also have the issue of the baker. Do you remember that? The issue of the Christian baker who was asked to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple who was getting married. Then the Supreme Court says, yes, but you can also still have your freedom of religion and not be forced into an action that you feel that your religion is against. It's not like he was asked to make a birthday cake. That's something totally different. So that's where you get into, in terms of federalism, allowing states to have these options to help people maintain their rights. It's a little different in this, and we're such a large republic. That goes back also to Federalist number 10. Why is it good to have an extended republic? Well, sometimes it can be a conflict because, of course, living in the South, in the Bible Belt, there's a church on every corner, that people tend to be more conservative in their social ideology, okay? So they don't like a lot of federal government involvement because they would rather for their states, who tend to be more representative of them with their social ideas, because of course you have to live in that state, and therefore those people are just generally going to have similar social ideas, are going to be more representative, and so people would want folks in the state to represent them in terms of social ideas. All right, so that's federalism, but also with federalism, over here you look at the types of federalism, and there are two types of federalism that we focus on. I went over all of them, but the main two for federalism, the types, are dual and cooperative. Which one is very separate and which one is blended together? So this one is very separate, and this one, of course, cooperate, it means together. So you have this more blend of federal and state. And that's kind of where we are a little bit more so today in terms of looking at who should be doing what in terms of federalism. But this will also depend on the situation that the country is facing as well. So, if we are in a crisis situation, sometimes the federal government might have to step into the states a little more in order to resolve those crisis situations. And then sometimes they need to step back and let states handle that. So it depends on the situation for sure. You also have over here the, there we go, McCulloch and Lopez cases. And those two cases in particular, another color. So with federalism, you also have the cases of McCulloch versus Maryland and U.S. v. Lopez as our two Supreme Court cases that's going to talk about federalism, where basically you're looking at, what can the federal government do and what can state governments do, okay? Also, you have some of the things that limit the power of states and limits the power of the federal government, but also what gives them power. So what are some things that gives the federal government power to control what goes on in America. The Commerce Clause is one. Implied powers is another. They're over here, right here. Supremacy Clause, Commerce Clause, and necessary and proper, which is implied or elastic clause. So, yeah, okay. And the supremacy clause. So these things, of course, are listed in the Constitution. Okay, so I want you to be aware of that. Those things are in the Constitution, and that gives the federal government power to do those things that they need to do, like control trade between states. Then you also have the idea on here of popular sovereignty. So with popular sovereignty, which is here, it relates back to self-government. So we're kind of connecting all these ideas together, but it's also a principle as well. So you've got these principles, and then you've got the structure of the U.S. Constitution, okay? So anybody want to take a picture of this hot mess before I go over structure really quickly? Anybody want to snap a quick picture? And I'll try to take some pictures of what I've got there and stick it on canvas maybe. If I can figure out how to do that on my Apple product. I have to get a tutorial. So, looking at the structure of the Constitution, how many articles are there in the Constitution? 7 articles. Just checking. Would it be helpful to know those? Yes. Are you going to have a question that says, which of the following is not an article of the U.S. Constitution? No. It's going to be a lot harder than that. So, when you've got the structure of the U.S. Constitution, all right, you've got Articles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I always like to block out the first 3 because that creates the federal government. This one deals with states, okay? The reason that I do that, if you remember from civics, maybe, I don't know, you've got the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. That's creating the structure of the federal government, okay? Separating them out, checks and balances, limiting the government. Lovely. But who creates the federal government? The people and the states. So Amendment 4, it should be, I guess, logical, even sensical, if I can use that word in government. I'm sorry. This is about states, about how states are treated, how states treat each other. Sometimes it's called the full faith and credit clause, where states should give each other, and the federal government should give states full faith and credit for the laws that they make. So, not that that always happens, but it's how they should be treated. Then, once you get to this point, you have the amending process, because you need to be able to change it. So, it should make logical sense that once you create federal government states, then you need to be able to change the Constitution when necessary. But at the same time, you are trying to create a stronger federal government. So you're kind of ending with a stronger federal government. Don't forget, federal government. And so that's your supremacy clause. And then last but not least, the one that everybody kind of leaves out, but the one that actually creates the biggest argument is ratification. Okay? So in civics, I always skip over that, like ratify, but I probably shouldn't, because this is the one, if you'll notice, that creates the split between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. When it comes down to it, when it's time to put your money where your mouth is, this is what splits up our country into people who want more federal government control or less federal government control. So ratification, 9 out of 13 states had to ratify in order for it to go into effect for everybody. Okay, remember our sentence? Let's eat jelly sandwiches and say rare. Don't do that again, Miss Gray. Okay. So the structure in itself is conceptual. So it's not like they did this on accident. They did this on purpose. Let's tick these things off one at a time, okay? So again, I wish I could just draw lines everywhere to everything. So your legislative branch is actually coming back to Grand Committee, right? So, think about your Grand Committee, think about representation, think about the Great Compromise, because you're gonna have to make laws first, okay? And those laws need to be supreme, don't forget. But you can change them, but the federal government still needs to be supreme. But don't forget, states have power too. Even though you have 3 branches of government for the federal government, you also have 3 branches for states as well. So it kind of all blends together. So how does ratification create a division in our government? Basically what happens is, and this becomes a hot mess. There's a lot of stuff here, right? But this creates our political parties. So you've got, first of all, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists and what they believe, okay? So George Washington's like, y'all probably don't want to have divisions in government because that's bad. And everybody was like, no, we aight. Fast forward to 2020. No, we aight. So you've got the Federalist 10, okay, and this is where I tried to limit my lines, but I couldn't. I got a little line happy. So Federalist 10, of course, is talking about the value of an extended republic. You have more voices, you have the ability to actually reduce corruption because more people are going to be watching. But the problem is with this, the Federalists, they're big federal government. They say you have to have a stronger federal government to hold everybody together. But it's not like they said we shouldn't have states. They understood that, if this is going to work, one of the problems in the Roman Empire, for example, because you go back to, these classical ideas of Greece and Rome, that one of the reasons that the Roman Empire could not stay together, and there's a whole lot of reasons, but that you can't have a one-size-fits-all. So having each state having the ability to manage itself and not be like a child of the federal government, okay, to give that state sovereignty. But how much is a big question. So that's where the anti-federalists are like, smaller republics are better, man, because, you've got people that are more cohesive. Like we were saying, in terms of the Bible Belt in the South. So people will elect folks to government who are like them. That's more of your delegate representation. And so you like this idea of a small republic because you will have like-minded influence in government, and that will be more representative of you. But the problem is that what that could lead to tyranny of the majority, right? What about those other people who live there that don't agree? Well, of course, some people today will say, well, move to a different state, right? But should you have to? No. That's why we have a democratic republic. Because even though, let's say, whoever becomes, Joe Biden's the president and, becomes inaugurated, those people that were Trump supporters are going to probably say, something like, oh, that's not my president. Because you heard people who didn't like Trump say that, look, he is your president. It's up to you to work to make your government representative of you. Because he still represents you, right? No matter who it is, they still represent you. But the main influencer of government is the citizens. And I want you to start thinking of yourself. Me, okay? Me. I am an influencer of government. Now, granted, I am a YouTube influencer because I have 31 subscribers. Okay? Yeah. I am YouTube famous. It's fine. But I'm also a government influencer because I participate more than just voting. Okay? I've also, I just want to say, I won't say what, but I've also participated in boycotts. I've boycotted places before. I have. Even for for almost 10 years, I boycotted a business in particular, and I said that out in the community. Everybody thought I was crazy, but fine. So, that was my belief, my personal, and I can do that. So, mischiefs of factions here, Brutus 1, Federalist 10. Now that leads us down to liberalism and republicanism. This is where students sometimes tend to get these ideas mixed up. Liberalism, liberal, republicanism, conservative. So luckily on this side, these two are very similar, liberalism and liberal, republicanism and conservative. So what's the difference? Like, this is your classical political government idea. So this is where you're gonna go back to like Greece and Rome, when you're talking about liberalism, you're talking about the common good, okay? When you're talking about liberals, generally what you're talking about with liberals and conservatives is how much federal government. So liberals want more federal government because you're looking after the common good, okay? So when you're writing an answer for a free response question, and you're trying to, if there's a question, for example, about political ideology, and you're answering as an example with liberals, you need to say why. Why would this be? Because liberals are looking after the common good. But for republicanism, and this is why you have the Republican Party, okay? Republicanism, usually this is lowercase r, by the way. Republicanism, or a republic, you're looking after individual rights, okay? So that's where you have conservatives, because you want the federal government to back off. That's where you get the idea of laissez-faire in economics. This is why they support supply-side economics, because you're looking at individuals in the business, as opposed to Keynesianism, which is more federal government involvement, where you're looking at your taxing and spending, where the federal government will get involved and get more involved in the economy to solve economic crisis, to get us out of remember in the business cycle, a contraction. Contraction is where our economy is kind of pulling back, where you're having more inflation and unemployment to happen, then you have monetarism, which can be used by either side, but it depends on how. So that's where you have monetary policy that controls the availability of money. This is credit, okay? Fiscal policy is where you have the idea of taxing and spending, okay? So that's where you get your tax laws. That's fiscal policy. Taxing and then spending that money. Maybe I should have flipped those, maybe, I don't know. But you are always looking at your economic indicators, okay? Especially with monetary policy. I didn't connect like monetary policy here to fiscal policy to the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is going to be the major impact on monetary policy, because the Federal Reserve is going to basically control interest rates. Now, I didn't put all this down there because I was running out of room, but remember there are 3 ways that the Federal Reserve controls the money supply: open market operations, the reserve requirement, and discount rates. Open market operations is the buying and selling of bonds. So the Federal Reserve will either give the federal economy money, put money out in the money supply, or restrict it. So the reserve requirement is how much banks have to keep on reserve and can't loan out. So they tighten it or loosen it. And that all is going to adjust interest rates. The discount rate is the amount of interest that the federal government will charge to banks who need to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. So mainly this all boils down to the interest rates on loans. And that's how they control that. Now, moving over here with party ideology, because now we have ideology and policy making, we're going to blend all this together. You ready? This will be our last one. So that'll be fun. Any questions so far? Is this making any sense, or am I wasting time? You already have this? So again, we have 3 main topics, especially for us at home. Our 3 main topics are, this is also for Unit 1, limited government, creation of the U.S. Constitution, and ideology and policy making. And it's because of the creation of the Constitution that we have this ideology and policy making. So when you look at ideology and policy making, what you're looking at, and I'm going to start this way and work over, party identification and party platform. So that's where you've got your Republican Party that's considered right-wing, and your Democrat Party, which is left-wing. But the social contract theory, this is my cone of certainty, okay? The social contract theory really does encompass all of this. Because again, the social contract theory is where you give government consent to rule over you, to be your ruling authority, so that you will have that protection of your rights, order, and security in exchange for agreeing to follow those laws. But Robert Dahl will say, of course, you better be involved in that, because that's limited government and political participation. So with your ideology and policy making, one of the biggest indicators, or the biggest indicator even, trying to breathe, for how people are going to vote is their party identification, right? You look at your party identification, and that will tell you oftentimes how people are going to vote, okay? So once you look at party identification and party ideology, then you also look at your party platforms. What's a platform? Anybody remember what a platform is?
Is it like the beliefs of the platforms, like where they stand on certain issues?
Because your platform is where you stand, and they're made up of, if you remember from civics, planks. There's planks for issues, and that's how you build a platform, get it? That's pretty cool to call it that. I didn't come up with that. So that's how they stand on certain issues. And so this is your party ideology. So also with ideology and policymaking, people are going to be politically socialized through generational effects and life cycles. So, you know, it's looking at issues your generation faces, and of course, as you get older, different things are going to be important to you. And then of course, globalization is also part of that. You know, outsourcing, and also with the economy, you're looking at meeting your wants and needs through trade, sustainability, environment, that kind of thing. So then also you have political opinion, which is going to be connected to all of this with your, you know, polls and credibility, and then these are your different kinds of surveys. I don't know if you guys at home can see all of that too, but there we go, down there at the bottom. Over here beside King Tut. So your polls, mass survey is probably the most important. That's why it's in all capital letters. That's where you try to get the best sample, representative sample. So you look at trying to get maybe like 1,500 random samples, good random samples, and that should help you to determine how everybody else would feel, but of course it's not always true. Entrance and exit polls, people coming in or leaving a place. Benchmark polls is where you're at, where how people feel about something before the campaign begins, and that's where you get your tracking polls all the way through the campaign. And you do have weighting and margin of error in order to try to offset any problems that you have with polls. Focus groups, but sometimes they're not great, of course, because they might not be a random sample. Straw polls are the fake polls, right? That's just where you throw out a question on Facebook, people answer it. It's not, I mean, it shows you how people who are answering feels, but it's not a really good indicator, so you have to have that credibility. So that covers everything. Any questions? And, so what kind of tool are you going to make for yourself to submit next week? Have you decided? What was that? Was that